Welcome back to the show. We're really excited, Jason and I, here to be back in the studio because we did some when we weren't here together. To have a very special guest.
Oh, I'm honored.
Wow. Who's flown in from Oslo, Norway. His name is Erik Rambech, and I know him for more than a decade.
That's true. Huh?
We met at DNV. We used to work together. And at that time, we were a lot younger, and we used to work in the young professionals organization at DNV, and we got to know each other really well. And so I've kind of followed Erik's story. We worked at DNV, and then we had this downturn where we also decided to close down the CCS unit where I was working on, and they decided to fire a lot of people. But luckily, we were in Norway, so they also gave you a really good package. And Erik, if I remember correctly, was one of those who took advantage of that and said, you know what, maybe now is the time for me to go start my own company. So he started a climate tech company called Endrava with another close friend of ours, Valentin, and he's going to tell us hopefully a bit more about that journey. So welcome to the show.
Fantastic. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
It's been about a year since I've been in Houston last, and every time I come back, I'm surprised first by the sheer scale of everything that's here. We like to think that things are moving in Norway, but it's way bigger over here.
Yes.
Wondering about where I should start the journey of Endrava and where to pick up. It's true that we go 10 years back now.
10 years back. Yeah. So Endrava is, from what I remember in our many conversations, is a tech platform where you compile all the emission sources in the world, right?
That's
and
correct.
it's called the CaptureMap. So tell us a little bit more about that in your own words, and then we can talk about the journey.
Cool.
Yeah.
So CaptureMap in a nutshell, that's the platform that we make. And it's about capturing all the big point source emitters across the world. So CO2. Do we have to talk a little bit about CCS, or do we CCS reasonably given at this point for the audience?
Our audience should
perfect.
know
Thank
CCS,
you. Yep.
but
Let's drink some water.
Yeah.
So what we realized is that we want to work with industrial decarbonization. And if you look in the bigger picture in the world, about 2/3 of the world's CO2 emissions come from large point source emitters. Think big manufacturing plants, think power plants, think iron and steel plants, cement, etc. So 2/3, that's roughly 30 gigatons of CO2 annually. And if we're going to have any kind of hope of reaching our net zero ambitions, somebody's going to have to do something with these big factories. And so we kind of fell into this backwards. When we started Endrava with Valentin, the other co-founder, in 2016, we wanted to help others reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we had a dream of making a product and service, but didn't really have any good ideas at the time. So we fell into what we did before, which was consulting. So we were trying to help our clients map out their emissions, trying to understand what can you do about them, how can you cut it, and how do you implement those measures into something that's tangible. And we're quite happy and quite good with numbers in Endrava. So one of our consulting assignments was about how do you actually make and find the potential for doing CCS in Europe. And that consulting assignment ended into a prototype for a tool, and that tool is now known as CaptureMap. So we tried to figure out, in very simple terms, how do you approach all these large point source emitters and figure out what can you do about their CO2 emissions?
Yeah. And where do you get the data points to the map? Is that public, or do people give you their big stack of files and you have to digitize them?
I'd love it was the latter, but it's the former. Yeah. So we base ourselves only on public data. And what you'll find is that if you're trying to look up one emitter, finding that public data is not that difficult. You'll be able to dig it up relatively quickly. But if you try to do that for 23,000 different emission points across 178 countries, you'll find that the data it's hard to find, it's hard to clean, it's hard to consolidate into one kind of unified overview, and it's hard to visualize. And that's what we do well with CaptureMap.
Talk to us about how you kind of stumbled that, this could actually be a product that you could commercialize.
Luck. Love to say it was something else, but luck came and rang our doorbell, and we were lucky enough at the time also to realize it. So this consulting assignment where we made a prototype for the tool, the prototype was actually not even part of the scope. We just came across so much data that Excel crashed on us, and we needed a different way to visualize the data. So we brought that to our client. At the time, that was something called the Norwegian Oil and Gas Association. It's now known as Offshore Norway. And we said, hey, we have a lot of data that we can geolocate. We can put this up on a map, and you can put tools around it to be able to update the map depending on your preferences. And they saw this and they said, this is pretty cool. And we have somebody who's looking for something like this. And they introduced us to a joint venture that's called the Northern Lights joint venture. Now, when I tell this story in Europe, most people in the CCS community are familiar with the Northern Lights. It's a joint venture between Equinor and Total Energies and Shell. And if I talk about Northern Lights here in North America, people are looking up at the sky and looking at me and wondering if I lost something along the way. But basically, it's a big initiative to try to pick up CO2 in Europe and then ship it up to the coast of Norway and then store it underground.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed to find who are these emitters that we need to approach. And they saw our tool and said, that's exactly what we need to do business development for CCS. That was the beginning.
So it's really geared for, in terms of like your ideal customers, are these project developers for CCS projects?
We're still trying to figure out what is the best product fit for what it is that we do. But we started with upstream oil and gas. And then quite quickly, we made it into capture technology companies. So the companies like Acre Carbon Capture, Ion Clean Energy, Sea Capture, who have capture technology, and they need to figure out what is the market potentials and where are things happening in the world. So they're a big client group of ours. It's going into consulting now as well. The DNV is using it, Rambech is using it, Bain has been using it, PA. So it's going into the consulting branch. Some of them are more project developers. Something called Storiga, which has a little bit of activity here, but are more based in Europe. They're more on that front. EPCs, so the ones that are building these capture plants, they also want to get in on this. So Technip Energies in France is using this, and Técnicas Reunidas in Spain. So we're trying to branch out. Something that we haven't kind of figured out yet is how do we get in on the government side of things and how do we get in on the finance side of things. Those are two nuts that we're still trying to crack. But yeah, so it's spreading across the value chain. So anybody who's really trying to figure out, there's a lot of emitters out there. How do I narrow down my short list of companies to talk to in an efficient way so I can do business development on the most likely prospects?
Yeah. And can you clarify, so what kind of emissions are you displaying?
Great question. So for now, it's CO2, pure CO2. So not other greenhouse gas emissions, no methane, no nitrous oxides, just CO2. But in essence, what we're building is an industry database, right? So there's nothing in the way of saying, why don't we look at NOx, SOx, particulate matters, methane, any kind of other type of environmental pollutant. But I think a lot of it has to do with focus, and we're quite a small company. We're a team of 2, right?
Yeah.
The more we do, the lower our quality is going to be. And then the more difficulty we have to compete against the rest that are out there. So we try to do very little, and we try to do it with higher quality than the rest. That's our little niche.
And you call it a map, and I haven't had a chance to see it in detail, but is this more about the graphical representation? Or at the end of the day, how are people really interfacing with the data?
Great question. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of both. Some companies like to use the visual interface because it's a lot of data, but it's pulled in a way that's, even for business developers with a non-technical background, it's easy to use. But there's also a way to export all the data, because what many companies often want is that they'll take our layer of emitters and the data that we have on them, and they want to overlay them with all the different data sets that they have on top. For example, pipelines, for example, storage projects, maybe their main clients, and they'll want to make their own maps of that. So they'll export all our data that's geolocatable, and then they'll import that into their graphical tools to be able to analyze that. So it's a bit of both, actually. Yeah.
No, and I think it's, going back to your earlier point of like focusing on your core value proposition that you're offering in terms of like CO2, because that's where we see a lot of founders, entrepreneurs go wrong, is because the more you go out in the market, the more people are like, well, I would like to see this too, I'd like to see this too. But really early on, not losing focus and saying like, can we make this work for CO2? And if you can, and if you see that it's meeting actually the demand, then you can obviously branch out later on. But that is essential, and you guys have managed to do that. But your journey has still not been linear, because you've also been through cycles where you hired more people and realized that you had to scale back. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about that too.
I think that also goes back to focus. So I mentioned in the beginning that we were trying to build Endrava as a consultancy because we dreamt of a product and a service, but we didn't have anything. So in the meantime, we decided to grow as a consultancy. And hiring people is in many ways a great experience. It's pretty daunting. But I think we went about hiring in the sense that we would find smart people and then we would figure out what to do with them as they came on board. And what we eventually came to was we saw that consulting takes so much time and energy to make that hamster wheel spin that it was cannibalizing the time that we wanted to spend on developing CaptureMap. So we came to a point where consulting was working rather well. I mean, we were able to grow the company. At most, we were 7 people in Endrava. But it's tough to bring people on board and at the same time train them. And perhaps we underestimated that part, and dedicating enough focus to that while at the same time figuring out what we do with CaptureMap. So we came to a point in 2022 when we realized that we're not going to be able to do both. And that goes back to your point about focusing, Nada. You have to be able to say what's going to be really the core of what it is that we want to do. And Valentin, the other co-founder, he's originally from France. And we missed the international context of what it is that we're working with. So a lot of our consulting projects was in Norway. I've spent 10 years in Canada, and I missed that international context as well. So I think we stared into each other's eyes one deep night and kind of realized this is not going to fly anymore. At some point, we're going to be out of business because it was starting to really take a toll on our family life. We were working more and more hours, and we saw that our revenue was increasing, but our profits was going down. So at that point, we bit the bullet and said, we're going to have to focus. So that's when this non-linear trajectory comes and the magic pivot word comes in, which really is another way of saying, yeah, you probably need to change a lot.
You messed up.
You messed up. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You made a mistake. And let's reevaluate.
And we were lucky to realize that early, right? I mean, we could have kind of built this company into the ground and not realized. So we were lucky to realize that early. And then we had to pivot the company, and that was painful.
Yeah. And tell us about the steps you took in that process.
So this actually, I'd like to blame Houston for that, if I can, because this actually happened as part of going to Houston. We're invited by, so we use a Microsoft platform to visualize all our data. It's a platform called Power BI. And Microsoft likes what we do with their platform. So they invited us to come to a conference called Sarah Week to display what it is that we were doing on a stand that Microsoft had. And Valentine and I, typical, this is very European or maybe even Norwegian. We were kind of like, we don't have time for this. Who wants to go to Sarah Week? And we told them no, straight up. We were like, we don't have time for this. And I think they basically looked at their phone as we hung up and they were like, what just happened? So they called us back and said, you guys don't realize what it is that you're missing. You need to reconsider. So we went here with CaptureMap, kind of early models of CaptureMap in our consulting business to display. Not one single person wanted to hear about our consulting business. Everybody wanted to hear about CaptureMap. And so that's when we came back to our other employees at the time after this conference, and we looked at them and said, we need to pivot and we're going to do this overnight. And they were brought on board mostly to be consultants. And they, with good reasons, were worried how quickly are we going to be able to pivot this and at the same time not making the company bankrupt. And at the time we had very small revenues of CaptureMap, and we didn't see that we would be able to support all our employees at the time. So we ended up going into severance agreements with our employees and basically spent most of the savings we had in Endrava that we had built up as a consultancy to come to severance agreements with our employees. And they left, and it was left to Valentin and myself, the other co-founder, to pick up the pieces and continue. So that was brutal. And at the same time, very liberating. So in hindsight, I wish we would have realized that earlier. I mean, hindsight is 20/20 vision.
In some ways, you have to make that decision because people are going to see the writing on the wall, and they're going to either stay and not contribute, or they're going to leave anyways. Because they're going to want to have a future for themselves as much as the business. And it eliminates that distraction, and that's where you really have to stay nimble.
I think you're spot on, and we were very happy to see that they were picked up overnight by other consultancies. So at least they were very attractive on the job market. But when you're that small of a company and you're building this from the ground up, these people don't only become your kind of your business relationships; they become friends, right? That was quite tough.
Oh, it is one of the hardest things. Why do you think now is the time, other than the obvious, we got to measure and maintain carbon, but why didn't this exist even 5 or 10 years ago? And don't tell me it's because Microsoft BI is that good.
It's pretty good. We still have things that we would like to do different in Power BI. I think there's something about working in the niches, I think, where, I mean, if you look at it, what we do is we try to be the highest quality provider of large point source emitters and their carbon capture projects around the world. It's about, 1/4 of an inch of breadth. It's very, very narrow. So I think back in the days, people are trying to understand, is this enough of a business market to make it fly? And if you're a huge company, maybe not. But for us, Valentin and I, we're 2 people, right? So I think there was a niche for us that we saw that we could approach. I think people are realizing more and more that not everything is going to be electrified or just put down in the ground. We're still going to need manufacturing. We're still going to need cement. We're still going to need iron and steel. And a lot of these processes don't have that many credible decarbonization pathways. So electrification is one of them, and that's going to help. Hydrogen is one that's going to help. Many of these plants also are going to need CCS in order to make it to net zero. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that realization that gradually is coming on. I mean, Nada, you're kind of one of the legacy people in CCS who started with this. We talked about it before the podcast started. You started with this way before CCS was cool, right? And CCS is not something new. I mean,
it's not going away either. Yeah.
No, and I mean, in Norway, there's been a field that's been injecting about 1 million tons of CO2 per year since 1996. Yeah. But I think the purpose of it now is becoming broader. So I think there's an upswing in the interest for CCS across the different industries. And I guess you're seeing that in North America as well. That's my impression, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, because of all the policy incentives that we have in the US now, right? It has really given a lot of traction to these projects that before we would have thought, weren't going to go anywhere. Like it happened in Europe 10 years ago. We thought all these projects were going to come online, but then economically they weren't feasible.
Nope.
But now with the policy incentives, with carbon markets, sometimes artificially being formed, it's allowing that to happen. So I think that's really the key. And I think it's great that you and Valentin are able to still see that as a big enough market, because what I think sometimes entrepreneurs and founders in sort of that awe of like being that unicorn, that big company, they want to go for like those big pies, so that they can go and get those big investments for VCs. But you guys have had a very different approach in terms of your fundraising too. It's all bootstrapped.
Yep.
Tell us how that conversation has been internally for you and Valentin in terms of thinking about, do you want further investments? How do you actually make this happen?
So we do get interest from quite a few different investors. The ones we feel have been the most honest with us have been the ones who've told us the longer you can keep us away, the better it is. And so we had a pretty tough year in 2022 and 2023 when we lost a lot of money on CaptureMap in isolation. But in 2023, we started making decent money. So then we're past break even on the cash flow. So it's an annual recurring revenue and it's a subscription service. So these companies, they sign up for a year at a time. And now that revenue is getting into the point where we're way past break even.
Good.
And for 2 people, it's more than taking out a healthy salary and having a little bit left on the side. So in one way, we're home free. And that gives us the freedom to choose how do we want to grow CaptureMap in the future. And I think that growth question is on a lot of the entrepreneurs' minds. You want to explode this. It's a question of size. It's a question of pace. It's a question of impact. And I think Valentin and I, we're also at that stage in our lives now where we really enjoy just being a founders team because we're very, very aligned on where we are and where we'd like to go. Now we're at a point where the money is good enough that we don't have to change a lot to be able to continue. And then at the same time, there's this small paranoia. Are we going to be outcompeted at some point? Are we going to be out of, are we going to be game over? So I think that's a challenge that we struggle with daily. So for now, we have decided we're not taking on investors as long as we're able to both technically and commercially grow the tool. So Valentin is in lead of the technical development and I'm in charge of the commercial development. That's what brings me to Houston to try to figure out more clients for the North American market. And it's a division that works quite well between us. We're both engineers, but he's definitely more technically gifted than I am. So we're happy about that. But then that growth is a question of how long can we do this ourselves? And at one point, do we feel that we're going to stagnate and that we need more help externally? And then I think founding could come in basically to find more people and try to figure out how do we scale this quicker than what we're able to do ourselves. Tough question, though.
Yeah, no, but not all companies need that outside investment, right? Because you could grow enough that you are able to self-fund your journey, but then it also depends on the pace that's required. And not all companies are meant to be, VC invested companies.
Yeah, and having done the fundraising thing myself.
Oh, that's interesting. Cool.
And raise the money. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of brain space where you're always trying to feed you got to feed the machine you've set up that's always cash flow negative.
Yeah.
And it's stressful, and kind of having control of your destiny has its own personal benefit. I'll tell you, like, I feel like I as we're setting up the Tech Nexus, I'm so less stressed now because I don't have investors and we're just kind of going at our own pace. But when I was doing my first company, it was always, okay, 6 months, we got to get back out and fundraise. We got to figure out who's going to put capital in.
That runway
the value
is front
prop?
and center. Yeah.
And that was all it was about, was when was our cash flow, at a cash date. And that was like,
Oh,
the
that
only thing to worry
resonates
about.
so well with you.
And
but
yeah.
you having been on that side, it's
Yeah.
good experience for me to hear about.
And it's definitely you definitely see entrepreneurs who, come out on both sides. And there's a time to take capital. It's when the customers are getting out in front of you saying, I need your product, and you just can't respond.
Yeah.
But you'll know when the time's ready that you're right. It's going to be to fund people. And that's when the capital is really about activation. So if you're in that position where you can just kind of run until everyone's like, give me more, and you say, hold up, we can't take more customers, like that's the time to go out and fundraise.
I hope we'll be able to recognize that. Something that
Yeah.
I like about the North American mentality more than the European is that you are better, in my mind, you're better at thinking big from the get-go. So kind of saying 5 years down the line, what's the ideal case of where we want to be? And then we'll figure out the how afterwards. In Norway, it's more like, oh, we're going to take baby steps and we're going to grow this one little step at a time, which is very safe. But ultimately, it also then leads to, are you meeting the potential that's out there, or are you kind of limiting yourselves?
So I think I know the answer to this question, but what is the exit strategy?
What is the exit strategy? So I think the vision that we have for Endrava and for CaptureMap is that we want to be the industry standard for industrial decarbonization market intelligence. That's a mouthful. But if everybody across the value chain, from governments to oil and gas actors to tech providers to consultancies, NGOs, if all of them are using CaptureMap as a common basis of facts, that's when I think we have achieved something. And so we're not there yet. We try to find lots of clever ways to put it into the hands of all the different actors. We had a funny story a couple of weeks ago where we have agreements with NGOs. So one of them is Clean Air Task Force, super, super cool NGO that's based out of here in the US, but also have activities in Europe. And NGOs, they get access to CaptureMap for very cheap. And we do that on purpose because A, we like to help NGOs, but it's also an excellent marketing opportunity for us. So they wrote a blog about the Middle East and decarbonization potential in the Middle East about 6 months ago. And that blog found its way on the radar of a journalist for The Economist. And then we ended up having an article in The Economist where they're looking at Saudi Aramco and decarbonization pathways for Saudi Aramco in the Middle East, and CaptureMap data coming on in a map in an Economist article. That's crazy.
That's good earned branding.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. So
Yeah.
we try to come up with all sorts of clever ways to do stuff like that. And sometimes we have control over it. Sometimes it's luck. In this case, it was very much lucky. But I think the exit for CaptureMap is we don't have anything else that we'd rather do these days. We like what it is that we do. We like the flow in the company. Valentin right now is on paternity leave. He has a little girl that he's hanging out with. We wouldn't have been able to do that in our consulting days. So there's a little bit of work-life balance that works better now. We're going to continue to grow the company. I think the exit could be interesting to us, speculating on, when we can get to a cash flow or a valuation of the company that means that we could be financially secure for the rest of our lives. Until then,
You keep doing what you love.
we keep doing what we love. Yeah, it feels very,
Yeah.
not very religious, but this very much feels like a blessing.
Yeah.
I get to work with something that's meaningful, that people are willing to pay us money for, and that we seems like we're being pretty good at. That's a good combo. Why would you want to change that?
Could you give us some tips? It seems like you and Valentin have a really good founder relationship. Like you're aligned on your values, you trust each other. How have you built that? And have you had challenges, and how have you kind of worked through them? Because I think that's pretty normal when you're building something together with somebody else.
Yeah, let me reflect a little bit on that, because it's been surprisingly easy. Valentin and I are similar, but we're certainly not equal. in terms of mindset and in terms of how we act with people.
Because similar is not always a good thing, right? Because
no. Sometimes you want those opposites so you can be able to complement each other. Why does it work with Valentine? I think Valentine and I have been trying to figure out the same thing. But sometimes there's that secret sauce and you can't quite put your finger on it. It just works. A lot of it is being very open about ideas and not shutting them down too early. Another one is there's definitely a huge element in trust. So we don't micromanage each other. So we both have very equal, even though we have different responsibilities in the company, we both have very equal access to the company. So if Valentine wanted to take all the money tomorrow and run away from Endrava, he could. Basically, I'm in Houston right now, so what do I know? I come back home, the bank accounts are empty, and he's gone off to some sort of whack island somewhere. That's possible, but that trust means also that I can be very peaceful without being worried about that. And so where I think Valentine spent most of our time is trying to figure out how do we focus the development of CaptureMap going forwards, and what things do we need to say no to? There's a lot of stuff that we say no to. Yeah. But why it works so well with Valentine, I don't know. Is it the French combo? I mean, I did marry a girl from the French part of Belgium. Maybe it's the French that somehow resonates with me. It's a good question.
Yeah.
How did you figure out that there was a good chemistry between you two? How does that work?
I think in some ways it's like we're still figuring it out, in part because there's like so much growth happening that it feels like we haven't had a chance to sit down and breathe and say, okay, what are we going to do for the next 6 months? So I just put on your calendar we're going to do strategic planning with everyone. When we get back from vacation, we're going to like sit in a room and figure things out. So I think there's a little bit of that, but you fall into these kind of grooves sometimes where it's like natural, I think is what it is. But there's always this kind of need to pull things back to, what are we doing? What is the mission? What are we going to do the next 6 months? And I think the last 6 months, and you tell me if I'm wrong on it, but it feels like we've been just trying to figure out if there's something there. And now we have like contracts and we got like 60 members, and I'm like,
wow, fantastic.
We should go like figure out like what's going on.
Right? How are we doing this? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What a good place to be though.
Yeah.
I mean, Valentine and I, we now go back, so we met in 2012, so that's 12 years making, right? Yeah. And in the beginning, we got to trust each other because we had projects together at our own at DNV before we left. And then there's an inherent trust that I think is building through going ups and downs with the companies. I think we became a lot closer during the pivot of the company, because then we had to be extra honest about where we were and where we wanted to be. And it was very much consulting that was the bread and butter in our company. So then having that honest conversation with Valentine about what is it that makes you excited about Endrava and what it is that we do there. Is CaptureMap the answer to that? Or is it something else that you'd rather do? So I think that brought us closer.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's sometimes it's like the years of you working together and then showing like, things having worked out. You kind of build your credibility with each other and start trusting each other more, because you're like, we've been through this now for, since 2016, so almost 8 years.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Now, right? So so it also builds over time, but I think in the beginning you also have to kind of make that leap.
Yeah.
Exactly.
With new founders, right? Like, so with Jason, me, and Juliana, it's like sometimes I can feel insecure, but it's like, then I have to tell myself, like, how do I take the leap and put trust there before, we have that experience, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that too, because that's where you can fall into that micromanaging or like, not trusting people. So some people I think also can have a history of trusting more based on their experiences, right? Based on how they've grown up.
And I'm like that to a fault. I overtrust. My
So I
son
think-
does the same thing. If a stranger came up to him on the street and offered him ice cream, he would go straight there,
It's like you're from Norway or something.
Yeah, I mean, you're from Norway, right? Like, why wouldn't you trust?
Yeah, and my wife is very different.
Like, why wouldn't you trust Norway, right? Like, the system works.
Yeah.
So I overtrust to a fault until I get disappointed, and she will be very skeptical and needs to build that trust gradually over time before she is able to tell you the first thing.
Yeah, so I think it's very much that too. And I think if you're the latter, where it is difficult for you to trust when you do enter into a relationship, you have to take that leap, right? You have to kind of just have that belief and work with it over time. So I think it's important.
Yeah.
Do you think as entrepreneurs, I mean, you've been in this field for a while as well now, Jason, do you think there's something special about entrepreneurs that they're inherently better at tackling that insecurity that comes along with it?
I'm not sure that it's inherent. I think it's learned, right?
Mm.
And,
Okay.
And this is my, you go through so much that's uncertain, that you learn to like roll with the uncertainty. And I think that if you think about the way a corporation exists, like when you guys were working together, it's very structured. It's very clear what the chain of command is. And if you don't know something, there's usually a function somewhere else that takes care of it. Like, I don't know, HR. How does payroll work? No one knows how payroll actually works, right? It's like you put in your hours, taxes come out, you get a paycheck every month, you get a thing that measures how much PTO you have. Like it's all there. Someone takes care of it. And then when you're out on your own, suddenly you realize, oh, this is like an abstract, arcane science that I'm now responsible for.
Yeah.
But it's okay. Because at the end of the day, you don't actually need all these structures, but you need just the mission. You need the thing, the value you're trying to create. And you will figure kind of those things out as they emerge as the most painful thing. And I think most entrepreneurs learn kind of what's actually important versus what's not. And I remember kind of being on the employee side, your head just kind of gets into these things where you really worry about things that are not that important, but are kind of important within the like social construct of a company sometimes.
Good reflection.
And when you realize that like that's not actually important for like what you want in your personal mission or your corporate mission, you can kind of get back to your core. And I think that's hard if you're kind of used to the structure. I guess, or you lean on the structure. And I think the good entrepreneurs know, like you said, what to say no to, what are you going to be focused the most on? Because everything could be important, but at the end of the day, it's only as important as like you make it in terms of aligning with your strategy and aligning with your goals.
Yeah.
And man, sometimes you learn that the hard way. So I like, there's plenty of experience that where I've done the wrong thing easily, and still turn out okay for it. Would not do certain things again because of that experience, but that gives the extra confidence of okay, I know how to deal with this. And I think the mistake a lot of early founders make, and you probably will resonate with you, is there's an assumption that I don't know something, so therefore I have to hire someone. And that's an expensive answer. But a lot of times, you just need that like 10 or 15% of knowledge that maybe an expert has. But at the end of the day, as the founder and manager, you still have to decide, or you still have to discuss it within your small team. You're never going to be able to offload that kind of decision making. So it's really a competition between what knowledge do you have to bring in, and when do you have to like make the decision. And it's the same reason why you hire an outside accountant or you hire an outside lawyer for like that little bit of time. They give you guidance. I mean, is this resonating with you?
Very much so. Yeah. And so there's one thing we've outsourced in our company, and that's the accounting side of things. We've done that from day one and haven't regretted it for a day. It's been fantastic.
But you still look at the books.
You still look at the books.
You're still the CFO, right?
And so we're CFO, we're CEO, we are chief commercial, we are janitor, we're secretary. So we do all those ranges of jobs, and that appeals to me because it gives me a certain satisfaction that I'm able to figure these things out and get it to work. But I also realize that there's a balance between, in my mind, none of this is impossible, but you have to focus on where you put in your time to make the most value for the company. And so I happen to think that accounting is probably not that difficult to do, but you'll still have to learn it. Is that the best use of my time? Is that what's going to push our company in the right direction the fastest? Probably not. So then we've taken care of that. But legal, for example, we don't have any in-house legal counsel. We do that ourselves until something gets very difficult, and then we have an external.
Please explain this to me.
And then, and so many of the companies that we do business with are huge corporations, like some of the biggest companies in this world, and they have legal teams that are the size of small cities. So we come with our standardized terms and conditions. Hey, I would like to have that, and then we get it back, and it's red like the sky is red for a sunset. And then we're like, we don't even understand the consequences of the revisions that they're proposing. What do we do here?
Do you understand indemnity yet? Am I the only one who doesn't understand what these things? It's always the big bold thing on the contract.
This is where I'm not going to comment that on the podcast.
That's when the lawyers get involved. Okay.
But we do have some terms in there to try to protect our liability a bit, and also to understand how we protect our IP. But for the rest of it, no. And something that very much resonated with me, Jason, what you said was, you need to learn 15% about something to be able to do understand enough that you can get by, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that you have to be a PhD in everything of all the different subjects that you touch as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. And I think that's bringing it back is like you have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And not everyone is. And so
Nope.
that's why some people are good in industry. But if you learn to like live with it and realize that a lot of the judgment still comes with you, like you'll be fine.
Yeah.
So it's a learned experience.
Something that I've picked up on the last few years is that there's one thing to sell consultancy services, and it's something else entirely to sell software. Software sales is not trivial. I'm not saying that consulting services is, but software sales is very much, it's a different ballgame. And I'm trying to put my finger on what it is that makes it challenging to sell software. But I think part of it is that you typically have to go through pretty big structures in companies. And there's lots of different people that you have to check off with to make this happen. And I mean, CaptureMap is not for free. So it's not like somebody gets to pull their Visa card to be able to put this on an expense statement. So you have to go through procurement, you have to go through legal, and you have to find the right people in these companies who have the need at the right time and who know the right people who can sign off on it. That's a lot of stars to align at any given time. That's something that we definitely underestimated going into to CaptureMap.
Yeah, I mean, I can attest to that, having worked in big corporates and working with these IT teams, right? And like, they're often very siloed. And when we went through like a digitalization phase where, you know, suddenly IT was supposed to be central because now we're going to digitalize all our operation and everything we do. But then they wanted to have a say if, you know, my CC unit wants to get CaptureMap, they want to have a say. Like, okay, have you compared it to all the other tools that are out there? And like, you know, so it's not very easy for these big companies to make these contracts. Like consulting is easy because then you're coming in from a limited amount of time, and if you know you don't like and you understand it a little bit better, and it doesn't feel so intrusive.
Exactly. Yeah.
So something about IT and like SaaS, even though we've been doing it now for 20 years, like that these 100-year-old companies are often not used to it.
Yeah.
And how to set up these contracts are not so open because they don't understand the software and how it's going to impact and connect with, all the other tools that we have in the company.
Yeah. That resonates with me a lot as well, actually. Yeah.
I feel like maybe I'm going to get a lot of hate from the IT folks. IT is not the friend of entrepreneurs and innovators.
Why is that?
It feels like their job is to say no in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's because the systems are complex. They're probably under-resourced. But man, every time I'm like, how do you get around these guys? Because they're not in the game of saying yes, right? I don't. How are you running into that?
I have a funny story about that right now, actually, because we are renegotiating a contract with a European oil major. And we have gradually built up from having 3 licenses with them, license per license base, to going up to 10 licenses. And now we're renegotiating for company-wide access. And all of a sudden, when you check off the little checkbox that says company-wide access, the responsibility for procuring that in the company gets to an entirely different division. So all the kind of hurdles that we've passed with this individual team before, and it's been very direct dialogue, all of a sudden this is passed off to a corporate function.
Yeah.
And it feels like I'm talking to a new company.
It's all brand new sale. Yeah.
It feels like there's no, other than the company name that's on top that says it's the same company, it feels like it's an entirely different world.
So I think the secret, and this is like when you see these kind of like Asana or Mixmax or these other tools, they just make it so easy for individuals to sign on for these free version.
Yeah.
That suddenly just pervades everywhere. And then the IT department has to look at it like, oh, 60% of our staff are already using this. They'll revolt if we turn it down.
Exactly.
Right. And so there's like this sneaky way they get into systems where it's just very easy. As soon as you refer another, coworker in, I mean, it's the same with Slack, right? Like suddenly you get this free Slack, everyone's on it.
Super smart.
And then all your, and their whole thing is the data, disappears after 30 days in terms of the messages. And suddenly everyone's on it and they go, I can't find that note from last month. We got to pay for this. And it's $12 each person. And what am I going to do? It's, so there are these strategies that I think they figured out and you were talking about. In the US, we're very aggressive about thinking about the exit in some ways. I think you're very aggressive about figuring out how to get your hooks in a company.
Smart move. I think we could learn something
because
there.
It works, but it also works where that product is, it's under $100 a license. So literally anyone can swipe it on their credit card to get in. And I'm not sure it's the same where I assume average contract value is over five figures for what you do.
It is.
So slightly different sales process. Anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that cool. It's SaaS is hard, but at the same time, I see, when we're talking about climate tech and investments and talking to like investors and venture capital, like they're all interested in SaaS as if, just because it's a SaaS company. I guess they're thinking that long-term it's more scalable.
Yeah.
And then they don't have to make that much investment. But at the same time, there's like bigger hurdles to go through in the beginning to actually make those sales happen and to get that product market fit, right? Until it becomes a household name. And then people start coming on and saying, okay, yeah, Microsoft, obviously we're going to use this Microsoft tool, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that, Jason and I have been doing here in Houston is helping companies like yours that are working with the energy transition in building a community around them and really supporting them. So I'm curious to know, for you guys, was there that community in Oslo? How did you take advantage of what was there to build your company as, being two solo founders?
We could have done that a lot better, I think, than what we have. And I think part of that was that we came into this bootstrapped, but with revenue from our consulting business. We didn't really have to engage with the startup community and understand what it was to set up our own company, because we kind of hit the group. 2 days into starting Endrava, we got our first consulting assignment. And we were busy figuring that out instead of figuring out how to build the company. Maybe we should have taken a step back and thought a little bit more about that in the beginning, but we were too busy to get cracking that we did. So I think there's a lot of advice that we could have picked up along the way during that. Incidentally, we actually spoke a little bit to your husband, Nada, way back in the days. And that was very valuable advice, because Nada's husband is also a founder. And he had gone through many of the lessons that we needed to learn. And so being able to interact with somebody who had been there, it was more on that level that we got to engage and get advice, instead of seeking out the broader startup communities and getting advice from there. So I think in hindsight, that's probably something that we should have done more. And I think there's a huge value to what it is that you are doing, because there's so many questions that are unanswered, but also so many lessons that people have learned the hard way before, that if you have a little bit of intelligence between your ears, you should try to not make their mistake one more time. Yeah.
Do you engage with like the Startup Lab in Oslo or like other communities that exist?
So we've actually had Startup Lab as a client to help them out with their greenhouse gas emissions. So in a different way. Yeah. Not yet to a large extent. We've had a couple of ideas. I'm thinking back. No, we've had a couple of meetings with them way back in the, Startup Lab from before?
No. Please tell me. Yeah.
So it's a incubator community in Norway that helps tech companies in Norway build and scale all sorts of different products and services, but mostly within tech. And they're very good at what they do. And we've presented CaptureMap to them a couple of times and kind of felt our way through, do you think this has potential? And they've been adamant that said, you guys need to just go do this. So in that sense, it's had a value. Yeah. Somebody else who have keen eyes and experienced eyes and try to figure out how to build companies and say, do you think this has potential? And they said, yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about Houston. I assume you're here for the customers, because we have some of the larger, CO2 emitting companies here.
Yeah.
Are you plugging into the innovation ecosystem, or is it just knocking on doors while you're here?
A bit of both.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give a shout out to a lady called Diana Jang, whom I interacted with a couple of years ago, and she also set me up with different connections around Houston, including you, Jason, from way back in the days. So I have a feeling that the Houston ecosystem is about knowing people who will not be your direct customers in itself, but they know people again. And something that I feel works very well here in Houston is that you're good at paying it forwards.
Yeah.
Much more so than I feel what is in a European context. So that's cool. That being said, the people that we typically need to talk to in these sorts of companies, they're very few and far between, right?
Yeah.
So it takes time for us to identify the right people. And then it takes time for us to understand within these companies who are in the US and Canada, do they have enough of a need for our product that I can justify a sale? So in the US, there's a couple of big public databases on emissions. And if you're reasonably handy, you can get a lot of that data by yourselves. It won't be the same accuracy as our data because we clean it quite a bit. But if you need a ballpark, it's hard to justify the expenditure of CaptureMap just by, if you want to work with emitters in your backyard in Houston. So that's a little bit of that experiment of going here and trying to understand, are we able to build up a business case for companies that operate predominantly in the US and Canada? Or do we need to go after the companies with a Houston headquarter, but with a global footprint?
Is that because in some ways our market is behind the European market in terms of trying to manage carbon? Or is that because the way data is constructed here is just different? And so I guess I'm asking, is it a market problem in terms of them not being mature enough?
Yeah.
Or is that the data is readily available in a different format that they don't, it's just a different dynamic?
I'd say a good part of the data is available already. Something that we do quite differently. I haven't talked so much about the tech stack behind what we do, but one thing is collecting data from these public databases about emitters, but we're also building our own database of carbon capture projects. And for that, we're using artificial intelligence to make that work on an efficient scale. And then we connect it back to the emitters. And nobody else is doing that yet. So I think that's where we're starting to come in and have a value add, is when you start getting updated information about what are all these emitters doing, not only their historic CO2 information, but do they have a capture project in feasibility, in EPC, or in operation, and data around that. And that connection, I think, is something that is also encouraging to the US market. So I think part of it is being here. We're going to this conference there's a CCS Tech Expo tomorrow on Thursday. We're giving a presentation there. We're having a stand. So I think part of it's visibility. Our biggest challenge, I think, is being known out there. I like to think that we're competing with Taylor Swift in terms of popularity. For now, she has got us beat. But I heard a story of one company, a capture company, was going to an e-fuels company, and they were discussing projects together. And they both, in the video call, pulled up CaptureMap to start to look at opportunities. That's my dream day.
That's what you want. You want to be that pervasive that it's almost invisible.
That's my dream day. And one guy says to the other, you're using CaptureMap as well? Oh, that's great. Great data. Yeah. That's where I want this to be.
That's that endorsement.
Yeah.
Good.
So Houston is a test. Focus is important for us. Are we able to build a North American market without feet on the ground here? Maybe we have to figure out other ways to tap into the innovation ecosystem here to get more solid connections. It's something that I'm struggling with. I don't know yet. Yeah. What do you guys think? Do you need feet on the ground to be able to do business in North America?
I think the energy industry is surprisingly relationship driven, and so as opposed to being transactional, right? Yeah. And part of it's, and you know more maybe because I haven't actually worked in industry, but folks tend to work together at various companies. And you'll run into a group that they all worked at Shell. You run into another group, they were all together at Schlumberger. And what ends up happening is as they kind of mix through the different sides of industry, be it on the service provider, be it on the production side, that's always their like first line of call is like, who's the other folks that I worked with in the past to help me understand what's going on, to help back channel kind of the conversations. And it might be, and because of how large the CapEx dollars are that people are dealing with here, they're trying to really, A, there's a lot of money on the line, but B, you want to make sure you're doing the right thing in the relationship between the customers and service providers. And it's not just, I'm going to throw a proposal over and it's, whatever hits the rubric the best. At the end of the day, when you're out in the field, like if you're in the Permian Basin and stuff isn't going well, you want to know that there's someone you can call and they'll fix it. Yeah. Because the costs are just extraordinarily high, either through penalties or the cost of, human, life and livelihood. And so that trust needs to be strong. And so you need to show up. And it's, the first pilots that we got for my technology company were all, based on relationships of our investors, where someone, basically carried us through the line. I had no idea. I'll be honest. I have no idea how we sold this product the first time. I was like, they should not have bought it in some ways because it was so early. And it was really based on that, that relationship driver, and that really empowered us. But it was, as a 20-something, I had no idea how valuable those champions were for us. So I think your experience is similar. You're seeing with like Deanna, it can really pull you forward because people have been in it, and even we're in the Digital Wildcatters studio here. They were out in the oil field themselves. That's where they built a lot of their relationships, and how they've been able to kind of catapult this business is because of the relationships they had when they were in the field. And so I think it's I don't know if that's a U.S. phenomenon or not in terms of U.S. oil field.
Yeah, I think relationships are important. Like they need to see you face to face, right? So that is important, but it doesn't mean that you have to have, especially for your business, right? Being a SaaS platform, if something goes wrong, you don't have to be here to fix it. You don't have to go
Yeah,
on
well,
field.
but they're going to call you in the middle of the night.
But they
saying,
might
"Why is
call
it not
you.
working?"
They might call you, right?
might
Yeah,
call
if it's
us,
not
yeah.
working. So I think in that sense, it is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're trying to figure out, is it important enough that we have to have local presence, or are we able to get by? And for us, that's still an experiment.
It's funny because we were talking about IT departments earlier. In some ways, IT departments will buy stuff online without seeing anybody because they don't. I don't know if they just don't want to be in front of people. But if it's the business manager champion, I think you do need to go out and meet them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean. I think they're used to working international. So as long as they know how to get a hold of you and that you're the one accountable, you know, they might call you in the middle of the night, your time, but also they're going to want you to come back in the morning and say, okay, this is how I'm going to make it right by you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. So I wouldn't necessarily say you have to have an office here or people here, but they're going to want to see you show up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It mirrors very well the experience that we've had with our company so far. So for right now, we have probably somewhere between 40 and 50 companies on board. And what we've started to do more and more deliberately is invite ourselves over to where they are and sit together with them and use CaptureMap together and try to understand what is it that they like about the tool and what is it that they're missing. So it's huge insights for us for getting more development ideas, but it's also a really different way of cementing the relationships with these companies.
Yeah.
And I think if we do get more customers that are US based, we have some American based companies that have headquarters here, but it's mostly their European teams that we're talking to.
Yeah.
Without that FaceTime, you're not going to be able to get that on Teams or Google Meet.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. No. So I think we would definitely have to come over here on a more regular basis, which is not bad. I get to hang with you too, which is pretty cool.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Come to Houston.
Yeah.
On that note, you've been to Houston now a few times. Tell us a little bit about like your reflections on Houston, the city, in terms of what's happening here. If you've interacted with the startup ecosystem, and also if you have a favorite place in Houston that you could recommend to people.
Oh, is this where I get to go into my story of getting my car towed this morning?
Yeah.
Or,
Is that a favorite place or a
Is it
least favorite place?
Yeah. Something not to do.
Something not to do. Don't get your car towed. That is expensive.
Yeah.
Interacting with the ecosystem here, I feel like I'm at the very tip of the iceberg. So last time I was here, I was talking to some institutional VCs, some that also came from oil majors, their VC arms on oil majors. And since we're not really looking for VCs at this time, it was more to get an idea of, is there product market fit and understanding who in their companies we should talk to. For the rest of the ecosystem, I feel that it's something that we haven't tapped into enough. So that's why I'm very happy to be on your podcast today, to be able to explore that more. We did a podcast together with Jay Corley at Digital Wildcatters about a year ago. And I know that there's underutilized potential there as well. So this is something that we're, I think, learning by doing. Definitely not an expert yet. As you can hear by my answer, this is very superficial. Yeah. I need to be able to invest more time in that.
Okay. I got a loaded question.
Yes.
Maybe you won't know. So I know very little about Norwegian food, even though like I'm supposed to be like, I think an eighth Norwegian.
Good for you.
What is the best Norwegian food in Houston, and what is good Norwegian food? Those are the two loaded questions.
Oh, wow. Those are two loaded questions. So when I go to Houston, I don't normally seek out Norwegian food because it's pretty good at home. But I did run by an IKEA the other day.
Okay.
I drove by an IKEA, so it was close to home.
Close
That's
enough.
Swedish. Yeah, that's close enough. This morning, I ended up going to Tim Hortons because I used to live in Canada for 10 years. And they have great but awful coffee in a weird way. It's hard to explain. It kind of makes your body feels rusty but alive at the same time. That stuff really hits you. Yeah. So for Norwegian food in Houston, haven't searched it out. Pretty sure there's a decent Norwegian expat community here.
Yeah. So there's got to be some decent food. That's what I'm.
There's got to be some decent food. What I particularly like in Norway is the fish.
Of course. Yeah.
If you like fish, Norway is a good place for
Their
fish.
salmon is really good. Yeah.
But I mean, this is a loaded question because my wife, who's from Belgium and actually born in France, she thinks Norwegians eat to survive. So that says something about her expectations and experiences with Norwegian food so far. Yeah, they have a different approach.
So Norwegians are really good at making like buns, like cinnamon buns and things like
true.
that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So heavy, I think heavy rich food because it's cold in our country most of the time. So we can do some pretty decent meatballs.
Lots of carbs.
Yeah. Lots of pork in our food. Not a place to be if you're a vegetarian, I think. But yeah, that's what I would accentuate. And how you could find that over here. You have good food already. Isn't Houston a food town?
Well, Well, it's a town that mixes food a lot, and so that's why I'm curious. It was a place that was good in fusion.
Mhm.
So IKEA is not fusion.
No, that's not fusion. As for favorite spots in Houston,
Yeah.
I am all ears. Typically, when I come here, I'm focused to a fault, right? So I go to my hotel, I prepare, I do work, I go back to my hotel, I sleep, and I repeat.
Okay.
So I could do something to leverage that experience a little
How
bit
are
more.
you on spicy food?
I used to live in China for 6 months, and that was an eye opener for me for spicy foods. And after I'd burned off my tongue for the 3 first months, then I was much better after.
Okay.
And I think I've lost touch, but yeah, spicy food's not
All
bad.
right.
You have a recommendation for a spicy food place?
It depends where you are on the spectrum, but there's a lot of good spicy food here.
I like that.
Yeah.
Are you good on spicy food?
Oh
Jason?
yeah. Oh yeah. No, I
Oh.
like all the spicy food. It's actually to other people's detriment usually. They don't enjoy it.
There's a
as much.
Swedish expression that goes, the only time I sweat is when I eat, which I think is funny because they don't have very sweaty, spicy food. But yeah, it's the Swedish approach to things. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Do you have a climate impact story, something that really inspires you to work on this project?
Yeah, it does get a bit personal. So my parents, after we lived in Montreal together, my parents moved back to Norway. And my sister and I were offered the chance to stay behind in Montreal. And we were 16 and 17 at the time. Kudos to my parents for having the balls to do this. And they said, we're going to pay for your apartment. And the only thing we want in return is that you're going to give us the school results we want. And so when we did that, we stayed in Montreal. They went back to Norway and they said, all of a sudden, we're going to act as if we don't have kids anymore. So they went to a set of islands north of Norway that's called Spitsbergen and Svalbard. I'm not sure if you heard of this, but Norway basically stretches out like a long spaghetti. And at the way tip north of Norway, if you go an hour and a half by flight further north, there's a set of islands called Svalbard. So it's one of the northernmost civilizations in the world. And they naturally have a lot of snow and ice up there. But it's also one of the places in the world that feels the impact of global warming much quicker than anywhere else. So, true story, my parents, the place that they lived in Spitsbergen, they ended up staying there for 10 years. And I lived there 1 year by myself. Did you end up going there? Nada, have you been?
I went there with DNV once.
No way.
Yeah, for a project.
It's like nowhere else I've ever been in the world. It's crazy. But the effects of climate change were such that the village where my parents lived usually never got taken by avalanches. And the year after my parents moved back down from Spitsbergen, their house was caught in one of the avalanches that actually moved other houses around and several people were killed.
Yeah.
And that's because of climate change that they said this is very different precipitation and climate temperatures than what we're used to.
Yeah.
And they attributed that a large part to climate change. So it's tough to tie individual climatic events down to climate change, but in this case, they were able to make a pretty good link.
Yeah.
So I think that for me was a big impact story, just because it's starting to affect the places that we live.
Yeah.
That's an impact to me.
That's like the invisible parts of climate change. I was having a friendly argument with someone over at the S% about the challenge of global warming, and his perspective was he likes it warmer. It's not necessarily a problem, but I think it's these transient effects that are really the things that are most unpredictable because they're a little invisible and they're catastrophic when they do happen. And almost immeasurable, right? Like we can go off and measure, how many people are gonna, passed away on Hajj this last time because it was too hot. We can measure, unproductive work time because it's, again, the heat issues. When you talk about like the storm that passed through, that was crazy a few weeks ago. That was like I don't even know what it was. It was like a hurricane that formed over land and it created like a tornado. There was no predicting that. It was like a freak storm that happened overnight. And it's that kind of classic unknown, but it's because there's something going on with the climate where it's a transient effect. And I don't know if anyone's going to say that's a climate, result of the climate change. Just like these avalanches are a result of just kind of the transient nature of going from one temperature to another. Yeah. And we're just not, because we don't see it. It's going to be invisible until it happens, and then it's too late to plan or react. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that happened to your parents.
It gives meaning to the work that I do, so that makes a lot of sense. And I think the individual events that you're seeing, it's tough to tie that down into a bigger development. You need to sit down and look at the data. And for a normal human being who's so busy with everything else that's happening in the world, then that's difficult to do. But what scares me about all of this is the accumulation of all these events on a bigger scale. At some point, I think it's going to lead to a mass migration of people on an unprecedented scale. And I don't think we're set up for that.
Yeah.
That's what scares me. I think there's an imbalance in this world that's going to be accentuated by the climate change, and it's going to be lack of food. It's going to be lack of water. It's going to be places basically inhabitable because of climate change. And when all these angry and people who have done nothing wrong, but basically have their livelihood taken away from them, when they need to move, that's going to be a tough situation to deal with. It's already starting to happen.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, it's already happening, right? And you see the younger generation are really feeling it. They're out on the streets, they're protesting. And so I think it's the other older generations who are so comfortable in our shoes and, don't think that, don't want to believe it.
Nope.
But definitely the signs are there. And like you're saying, if you sit down and look at the data, any human being would be able to see like, okay, we definitely should be doing something about it.
Yeah.
But it's the way that we have set up our lives. We get so busy just making ends meet. And places where it's having the most impact, places like Svalbard, there are not many people living there, right? So you don't see how much snow coverage has been lost. You don't see the population of the polar bears declining and all of that, right? We don't see it here where majority of the populations live.
Nope.
So it's really in those areas where you're seeing these drastic changes. And, our hope is that with companies like yours and people like you, that we can all wake up to it and be able to tackle this in a timely manner.
And with the communities that you are building, because we need to work together.
Yeah.
This is not a one-man show.
So I guess as we wrap up here, is there anything our audience can do to support you in your journey?
I think for one, I think that level of collaboration that you two are and the other co-founder are building, it takes collaboration across these spaces. So having an open mind towards figuring out how do we help each other on these climate change impact stories. Climate change is tough to fight, right? And the tech is hard to build. I've seen a lot of good stuff coming out now on kind of the first of a kind founding. That's super, super challenging for these sorts of companies. I think daring to test out new solutions, even if they're not fully baked, I think that helps companies a lot. That we had a very early client who was willing to take a chance on us. And they were pain at some points because they were so demanding, but it also helped us to build a product. So if you're a big company and you're connected to a big company or a small one and you want to take a chance on somebody in a startup community and say, hey, let's figuring out this together, take a chance on them, I think that helps a lot.
Yeah.
I think that would be my one point that I would single out. Take a chance on these founders building companies because they're pretty driven. They're working with something that has potentially huge impact and they need help to get going.
Good. I think we should end it there.
Yeah.
Good.
Love it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.